When first people thought about doing surgery on broken legs, some people would object we should not play God too. So the question is really, when we discover how to interfere with the body and with biology, it's always the question, are we playing God or are we just healing the brokenness of creation? Because after the fall, creation is broken. And so I think basically it's an ethical question. Is it allowed to change the genes of a disease that is caused by just one gene that is in the wrong way? Would it be allowed to use the CRISPR-Cas scissor and change that one gene? And I would say, as long as we try to re-establish the potential that God actually thought to give to a person, healing diseases and so on, I think that should be allowed. But as soon as we start to play God, like you just indicated, like I want to have a child with blue eyes, blonde hair, intelligence quotient by, let's say, 130, then of course we end up in the designer baby world. And this, in my opinion, is playing God. And also what that shows is that our love easily can become conditional, because we love our child only because it has certain properties. They have certain properties like hair color, intelligence, and so on. And this is, of course, not what God has intended. God wants us to love each other, every human being, unconditionally, as He does with us. And we should be perfect as our Father is perfect, as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. So I think that's the basic principle, probably, generally for bioethics, for any question in bioethics. Are we trying to alleviate the curse consequences of the fall? And I think this is part of helping the suffering and diminishing the amount of suffering in the world. And on the other hand, there is this, I want to design my own organism and so on, which is playing God, being my own creator or the creator of my children. And I think this would be the ethical boundary for using these genetic possibilities. And of course, there is the CRISPR-Cas scissor, but there are other methods. I mean, for 3,000 or 4,000 years already, mankind has breeded crops, for example. Like wheat is a breeded crop. Wheat in 2,000 years ago did not have as many grains. It has many more grains today than it had 2,000 years ago. Because of breeding, mankind managed to optimize that. And it seems that this is allowed. Why shouldn't we do that? Just to breed and thereby helping natural reproduction. And CRISPR-Cas is also a natural enzyme that works in the body, and we can use it for certain purposes if we help our cell to establish in the right way. That's the way how my friend actually has defined that. And I think that's quite helpful. And then, of course, there are other criteria. The first criterion is the salvation history criterion: healing or playing God, creating. The second criterion, I would say, is, can we actually predict positive or negative consequences of a method? Is the interference with the natural processes reversible if something goes wrong? And with some of the methods, of course, we don't know that really, whether we could reverse it again or whether there are negative consequences that we don't know. And this is a risk that has to be taken into account, of course. We can't be sure that the scissor somehow does something else with that too, that we just have not understood yet, because research is just not as far as it is, for example. And so that is something that is changing, and I cannot tell you how far the state of the art is in the moment with that. And then we have a third question. that we could ask ourselves, and that's with which being do we want to change something? Is it a plant? Is it an animal? Or a human being? And in which way are we maybe changing the dignity of that living being? If you think about our modern agriculture and think about chicken that are breeded in batteries, in very narrow cages and so on, this is certainly not the dignity that God has planned for a chicken to live by, I think. And so if we now start to use CRISPR-Cas in order to produce bigger and fatter chicken, for example, and that might be possible by changing the corresponding genes so that they put on more weight and more fat. I think that is again playing God, or really changing the dignity of the chicken in a way that was not intended by God, because the chicken should not be a product for our nourishment, but it is a living being that has dignity itself. And we are allowed to eat meat, so that's okay, but we are responsible for granting the same dignity to all living beings on this planet, because we are entrusted with the how do you call it, the stewardship over creation.
Mm-hmm.
And the same with plants. I mean, if we change the wheat from having few grains to many grains, I think that does not change the dignity of the wheat. But when we only produce monocultures of wheat on our acres and in our landscape, then this changes the dignity or the original intent of the landscape, I would say. So that's the third question that we could ask. And the fourth question, I have 5 questions, by the way, just that you know where we are about. The fourth question is, do we change something in an adult organism that has grown up already? So this is a minor change usually, because the organism is ready already. Or are we changing something in the embryo when this is still in development and might have bigger consequences? Because if something goes wrong, who is responsible for that? And maybe the embryo, when the person is 18 years old, says, well, you have changed my genes. I did never want to have blonde hair, but you made me having blonde hair. I would have had black hair, and I want to charge you for that. So there are juridical questions as well. Who's responsible? And if we change an embryo, who cannot give consent or assent, affirmation for that? And the fifth question that I have is, are we using natural methods that are innate to creation? Like CRISPR-Cas is a mechanism that is innate in creation, or are we introducing new mechanisms into creation that are actually not present there? Other technologies that are alien to natural processes normally. And so that would be a fifth interesting question.
So that fifth question, with introducing new technologies, I believe that would be those nanotechnologies, isn't it?
If you produce robots that enter the body and live in the body, yeah, but this is just a question. It's not a means of saying this is not possible. Just imagine a pacemaker in your heart. This is also not a natural mechanism, of course, but it's a battery-driven device, but it keeps you alive. And so I think it's possible, but we need to know that we are changing nature there, and we should think, is it allowed or not? And I think the best or most important question is question number 1. Are we changing or are we healing the consequences of the fall, of fallen creation, or are we playing creator ourselves? But the other questions are important to consider too. I mean, if we think it's responsible to introduce an artificial device into our heart so that it can run, and this is the only way to keep you alive, then of course we should do it, because we know that God is in favor of life. But there might be other purposes or other cases where we introduce some gene exchanging nanomachine or something that is more for optimization, or think about neuro enhancement, if you have heard about that maybe. I think this is a different kind of thing. Again, it's an artificial thing that is not normally present in your body, but it should change the capacity and the performance of your brain. And even we don't know the consequences, whether this will lead to negative effects in your brain. Yes, as far as I know, there are different methods how people do that already. One is just pharmaceutical. They take certain drugs, and these drugs contain hormones, for example, or other chemical devices or chemical substances that actually push your brain to work harder or to be able to concentrate better and so on. But as far as I know, often there are bad side effects of these drugs. You can become dependent on them. It can happen that the metabolism in the brain is so much exaggerated that short term you have more performance, but long term your brain gets damaged by these drugs. So it really depends on the specific drug. I'm not an expert in the drugs. I just know that you need to take care of these side effects that you don't want, of course. But on short term, you might think, yeah, I get better notes, better marks in my exams, and so I take it, and then you become dependent and you take it again and again, and you realize that your brain just does not bring the performance anymore, and there is a saturation effect and a decay effect at the same time of your brain performance. So that might be a problem. And then another device is, of course, direct stimulation by electrical stimulation of your brain. And this is actually used in military, as far as I know. I've not heard that this is done with students at universities, unless maybe for test.
Underground levels, so like Silicon Valley kind of area, or like something. So.
That might be just for research purposes or so, but I don't think that students at universities really do that. But they get a helmet or something like that, like soldiers get a helmet, and with that helmet, certain areas of the brain are electrically or magnetically, usually magnetically stimulated, so that they either are more active or that they are decelerated or damped. And for soldiers, of course, the purpose is to decrease the activity of consciousness, of conscience, so that they don't think a long time about should I kill that person or not, should I have pity or not, but that they just are able to shoot as many as possible in as short a time as possible. And this is, of course, really cruel. I'm not sure whether this is really done in real wars, but it is done in the lab, and the experiments in the lab show that these helmets seem to work to some degree, and soldiers wearing these helmets are more effective in killing other people in a virtual world. Of course, this is all in a virtual lab, and they have like appearances of people, and then they come from different perspectives, and you need to shoot left, right, and so on, and and they try to optimize the impulses so that they can shoot as many people as possible, and also are quick in perceiving where the attackers come from and so on.
What do you think about this like Neuralink device? Would you get one?
Yeah, this is a very difficult issue again, and also very ambivalent, I would say. Well, Neuralink basically tries to measure brain currents and to connect your brain with artificial devices in a direct way. And they've done that with monkeys already. Monkeys that can control in a computer the cursor, for example, and see how and thereby controlling or yeah, controlling the movement of the cursor on a screen and so on. So this can be done already. And of course, this has a large benefit. If you think about a person who is in coma, can't move at all anymore, but might still be conscious. And such people exist, that they even cannot move their eyes anymore, but they are still aware of what's happening, but can't show any reaction. Even no tears are possible and so on. And with them, these devices would be of great value because, and you can also do that with an EEG device by asking questions yes and no. And if they want to answer yes, they should think of moving their right hand. And if they want to answer no, they should think of a spider or something they are afraid of. And by the brain current pattern, you can decide, did they answer yes or no? Then you can check whether they answer the correct answer to 1 + 1 is 2 and so on, so that you can check whether they are conscious or whether it's just random and so on. So there are these things that are already possible to some degree. I'm not sure how much they are used already. And of course, by implanting such things, if there are also people who are lame and disabled in many regions of their body, and so for them it might also be a good possibility to express their will and what they want to do, or to control an artificial arm, for example, if you have no control over your arm anymore, or a leg, and so on. And it might be possible that people learn that, and so this will enhance again greatly the possibilities. But you're completely right. If that can be used in order to manipulate people in ways that they don't want to be manipulated and to take away their control, then this becomes a very dangerous tool again. At the same time, I would say that our brain is just the instrument by which our immaterial soul is interacting with the body and with the world. So the brain is not myself, so I don't think that I myself can really be manipulated as a person, but the control that I want to exert on my body, that might be interfered. For example, it seems people have found out when they did experiments with epilepsy patients that when they stimulate a certain region in the brain, that people become faint, they faint away. And when they stop the stimulation again, they become conscious again. So it seems there is kind of a switch for our consciousness. And if these switches become accessible on a large scale to a dictator or someone, of course, that's a huge tool. And so there are possibilities that we simply don't know yet what might happen. And it is again ambivalent, because it can be used to heal the consequences of the fall, but it can be used to manipulate the brain and thereby controlling a body that you should not control, but that belongs to another soul, to another person who is an image of God. I think generally it might be possible at least to produce the stimulation and to somehow stimulate a certain imagination that you have. But this is already done in neuromarketing, for example, when you go to the supermarket. There are lots of studies how people buy the best products and as many as possible and so on. And so there are several strategies that companies do, all neuromarketing things. And what people have found out, that human beings have basically two large systems how they make decisions. One is the intuitive system, which is very fast, but can easily be mistaken and manipulated. And then there is the other system that is very slow, and that's the rational system, but this cannot easily be mistaken. And the question is always, how do we make our decisions? And that's how conscious are we living? When you go to the supermarket and are in a hurry, you might just say, I grab the first thing that comes to my mind and I take this piece of butter and this piece of milk and so on, and I buy that and that. Then I'm finished within 5 minutes and I'm out again. But when you go there and are conscious and very rationally think about what you are buying, are ecological standards fulfilled? Is it fair trade? Is the price performance ratio well, and so on? Then usually you can overcome all the distractions and the imaginations that are triggered by certain strategies of neuromarketing experts in the supermarket and beyond. It's not only in the supermarket, it's everywhere actually. But nudging can always be used to manipulate you. But I think as long as I am in control of my brain and no neuroenhancers or other drugs are used, like alcohol. If you drink too much alcohol, you lose completely control of your body. You can't walk, you can't think, all this fades away step by step. So as long as I'm in control of my body, I will still be able to check for the thoughts that are constantly intruded or inserted in my brain, to resist and to weigh them and say, no, I don't want that, and yes, I want that. It's the same with pornography. If you go to the internet, there are little advertisements, and suddenly again you see a picture and you think like, oh, I need to click on that intuitively. But if you switch on your rational thinking, I'm not talking about switching on your brain, because your brain is switched on all the time, but switch on your rational thinking, your rational decision-making system, then you can say, what do I have from that? Do I really need that? No, it's a sin. I don't want it, so I don't click on it and I change the website, for example. Or I establish some device that switches off such advertisements and so on. So I can deal with that rationally. So I think even if they are able to filter certain imaginations and thoughts into our brain and into our mind, we should still be able to cope with them, unless at the same time they somehow introduce us some kind of anestheticum or alcohol or such a drug that really disenables us in order to exert control. That's a good question. I'm not sure. Well, certainly what is possible is that people who smoke marijuana or whatever, or even harder drugs, they can reach a state in which they are not rational anymore, but have some illusions, maybe even are connected to another world like demons and so on. I've never done that, but I've heard stories about that, so I can't tell you about that. And even some scientists have been trying to do that in order to find out which kinds of consciousness states we could reach. So that might be possible, but whether it's possible to synchronize them, like in that movie that I was mentioning with Trish, I really have to look that up. That might be an interesting movie for you. In that case, a group of people are actually manipulated in becoming an army and killing other people that they never would like to kill normally. But this, in my opinion, is still science fiction. You can switch off the consciousness of a group of people by smoking or by anesthetics and so on, but whether you can bypass their consciousness and filter the same thoughts into their minds, I think that's not yet possible. But that doesn't mean that it will never be possible. I'm not sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, if we look at the Bible, we see that demons obviously have that possibility. They can occupy people and they can bypass their control of the body and of thinking and just make them do things that they never would like to do. Like in Gerasa, if you think about that very serious case of a demon possessed. And when Jesus drove out this legion of demons into the pigs, all the pigs went into the lake and the person was completely normal. So basically it seems to be possible, at least for demons and for spiritual beings. We just don't know whether it might also be possible with chemical drugs or with electrical or magnetic stimulation of the brain. Generally, I can't exclude that completely, because science can always make progress. But I'm not sure whether our will and our thoughts and faith and so on can really be reduced to biochemical reactions in the brain. For example, there is this man called Persinger. He constructed a so-called God helmet, a helmet that you could put on your head, and then he would stimulate certain regions in your brain. And when he stimulated a certain region in the left-hand side, people would hear voices. At least they would report to hear voices and interpret these as external voices from aliens or from deceased people, from dead people, or from God, from Jesus, from Buddha, and so on, depending on what they believed in. So the result was not predictable, but he claimed that he can stimulate these experiences in people. And when he stimulated another region, they would not hear a voice, but they would feel the presence of similar beings, aliens, God, saints, Jesus, whatever. But another group in Sweden actually tried to repeat these studies, because Persinger was the only one to do these studies in the 80s. This group in Sweden, in Uppsala, actually couldn't reproduce that. And what they did is they built the same helmet. They even got the advice how to build that helmet and the building plan and so on, the construction plan. And then they took a group of about 90 test persons, but they introduced a double-blind study. That means that half of the people were told that they would sit in this room and the magnetic field would be turned on, like with Persinger, but actually with half of the people the magnetic field would not be turned on at all. Neither the test person knew it, nor the conductor of the test would know it. Only afterwards you could read it in the protocols, in the minutes in the recordings, so to say. And what they found out is that actually whether the magnetic field was switched on or off did not really matter. It was much more dependent on the worldview expectations of people. If people believed in a supernatural world and were sitting half an hour in a very dark room being told that something would happen with the magnetic field and so on, and hear certain noises and so on, some people, whether the magnetic field was switched on or not, some people would have such experiences and others not. So they claimed the magnetic field itself has no effect whatsoever. So this is still contested to my knowledge. I don't know that. So I don't think that you can actually force people to believe in God by manipulating their brain, or somehow force them not to believe in God. Because faith in God is not just a function of a certain part of the brain, and they were only looking for metaphysical experiences, transcendent experiences like visions or voices and so on. But when actually I have never seen God or have a transcendent experience of God, but still I would say I have experienced God. When I read the Bible, this is a very rational but also relational process, because I take it as God's word to me. And I try to understand it. So my rational areas in the brain are active, my emotional areas in the brain are active, and my relational areas of the brain are active. And so I can feel sometimes love when I read the Bible, or when I think about God and so on. So that's it's more a relational aspect, like with a human being, like with my wife or with a friend. And so I don't think that you can so easily manipulate the brain in order to change their faith in God or not in God. Yes, I think there is no direct mechanism. Of course, you can influence people, as I said, with alcohol or with marijuana and so on, but to force people to do something or not and so on, we would have all-encompassing knowledge about the whole body, about the whole brain. And actually, we've produced a documentary movie on brain research, actually. And a Nobel Prize winner, Thomas Südhoff, who's not a Christian, was also interviewed for this movie. And he said, we just don't know enough. We know about 2% of the brain. And the more we discover, the more questions come up, because the brain is so complex. It has 86 billion neuronal cells, neurons. And one neuron can be connected with up to 10,000 others. That makes an enormous amount of connections, trillions of connections in the end. And so to calculate that, there is the Blue Brain Project, for example, or the Human Brain Project, and all these projects, and they try to simulate somehow a mouse brain and the mice brains. And they have been successful to some degree. They can somehow predict some things when they observe a mouse or try to simulate the activity of the brain to some degree, but they are far away from really understanding how the brain works in general. They can concentrate on certain specific tasks and try to see how activities change in the brain and how that works to some degree, but we are still far away from really understanding how that works. We even cannot understand yet how the neuronal activity of Caenorhabditis elegans, this is a little worm, very typical for biologists. They use it for many experiments. And this worm only has 302 neurons in its neuronal system. And these 302 neurons, you can measure how they fire and so on, but they still are not able to predict when which one is firing and what is actually happening when this one is firing and that one is firing, and predict when what other thing is happens. So this is just 300 neurons. We have 86 billion on average neurons, human beings. I think it's very difficult to really grasp such a complex system. Even very large computers have their problems with predicting that. And then the question is it only a data transfer process? Because computers can only simulate data transfer processes, or is it more? Are there? I believe that human beings are souls, living souls, like Genesis 1 says and Genesis 2. Men and animals, they are all living souls. Living souls incarnate in a body. Our body is the incarnation of my soul. So it's my body, very original only for me, myself. No one else has the same body, but it's still my body, and when my body is dead, my soul is still alive. I can still be conscious and meet the Lord, as Paul says, and Peter also says this. So I think the Bible is quite clear, and if that is the case, then the naturalist paradigm to uncover and control the complete being will never be possible, because there is a soul that is actually in control of the body, and you can try to disconnect the control of the soul over the body to some degree, as maybe demons obviously seem to be able to do that, but I don't think there is another possibility. And the next question that you ask is about artificial intelligence. Could the Antichrist be artificial intelligence? I personally am not afraid of that, because artificial intelligence is just a complex calculating process, but there is no intention behind that. A computer is only doing what it is programmed for. So it's a process of chance and necessity, but there is no intentional soul behind that. This would have to come from some other source. Even though I know Nick Bostrom and some people are very much afraid of that they could develop consciousness maybe, but it's still science fiction. Yes, the interesting point is that people use the word learning for that, and deep learning and so on. But actually, when a human being, a mindful being, is learning something, then we deal with semantics. We think about what does it mean? when I see a sign, when I see symbols of a different language that I don't know yet. We think about semantics. But there is a very famous thought experiment in the philosophy of mind, the Chinese room. This is about a person sitting in a black box and having a very thick book of Chinese questions. And so from outside, people from China come, enter a certain question, the person picks it up, does not understand anything because the person is not able to understand Chinese, but it compares the symbols with the book, with the lookup table, and then sees, okay, if I see that symbol, then I will pass on this answer. So takes a response, puts it outside of the black box, and the person who has actually asked the question receives an answer and thinks, wow, very intelligent person in this black box, even though the person has no clue what this all was actually about, because an algorithm is stupid. It just follows a set of rules, but it does not understand. It cannot grasp meaning. It has no semantic dimension. It only has statistical and syntactical dimension, but no semantic dimension. And that's a big difference between any computer and any soul, being of a soul. That's an interesting thought. Well, in the moment we don't have this problem because our bodies are not immortal. Even if you look at mummies from Egyptian pyramids and so on, the bodies are dead. They are just mummified, so we can still see them and touch them. But I'm quite sure that the soul has already left the body. As soon as the body dies, the soul leaves the body. You even have that in the Old Testament when Rachel, the second wife of Jacob, dies. It says in the Bible that her soul left her, and the word in Hebrew that is used for that is the same as when you leave a building. So it seems that the soul leaves the body. And also Jesus says this, I think in Matthew 10. I can give you the scriptures if you want to, and refer you to a lecture of mine that is also available on the internet if you are interested in these issues. Jesus says, don't be afraid of those who can kill the body but cannot do anything afterwards, or cannot do anything about the soul, but be afraid of the one who can destroy the body and the soul in the hell. And of course this is God. Only God has authority to destroy the body and the soul. No one else. I even doubt that Satan has this power. I think only God himself has this power and the ultimate control of that. And so we should not be afraid. If they kill our body will decay anyway, because we live in a fallen world in which everything decays. It is only transient. But our soul, when our body dies, will be with the Lord. I don't know in which kind of state. It will be kind of an intermediary state. In Revelation it says that the souls of the saints are in front of God's throne, actually, and they call out to God that he should establish justice on earth. And it seems that this is not yet perfect heaven, because these souls still suffer from the injustice that is on earth, even though they are in front of God's throne. So to some degree they are safe and saved, but they still feel there is something missing. There is something that still needs to be done. And so they celebrate service and worship with God, but they look on earth still. And only when Jesus comes again and this old earth will be judged and will be finished, then the new heaven and the new earth somehow will be established, whether it's a transformation of the old earth and the old heaven that are transformed into the new one, or whether something completely new will arrive and the old one will just be rolled away. We don't know that, how that will happen, but something like that will happen, and then every one of us will receive an eternal body even. It will be a body that will be unique to every one of us, as our current body is unique to every one of us, and we will still see, like with Jesus, who was risen from the dead, you could still see the nails of the cross in his new body, but they would not hurt anymore. So you are indistinguishable. You are distinguishable still in your personality, but you will be you will not hurt anymore, but it will be you, and you will be completely healed and fine and enjoy who you are, and everything that has hurt in the past will be gone away. Like it says in Revelation, there will be no hurt, no cry, no fear, no trembling, no crying anymore. So it will be perfect heaven. I mean, if I were a naturalist, then this might sound plausible, because for a naturalist, everything is matter. And then also our body is nothing but a biological algorithm or a machine, and death then is just a mistake, a technological problem that can be fixed by inserting nanomachines into our body and so on. But if reality is bigger than matter, then I doubt that it is possible in any way by any machine to produce a living soul, because the only way how living souls come into existence, as we read in the Bible, is by the creation of God. God creates life, and then they are living souls. We don't see of any other power or person or being that could create living souls. And if life is a living soul, then this is not possible. Of course, we don't know exactly whether a bacterium is a living soul too. We just know that obviously some animals are living souls, like it seems maybe most mammals might be living souls and birds, but I even don't know about insects, whether they are included in the living souls or whether they are different parts of nature to some degree. We just don't know that, or whether they are more like biological machines, but there are indications that even bees have a way of relating to each other and some conscious interaction, even though much lower level than human beings. As human beings, we just don't know it. But I doubt, I'm not afraid of transhumanist agenda. I just think it's a waste of money, and it can destroy a lot of people by misleading them into the wrong direction, unfortunately. Well, that's of course again a very theological question. What does God allow and what does he not allow? It's interesting when you read in the Old Testament, when Saul actually approaches a witch and asks that witch to bring back Samuel, the judge Samuel, that has already died at that point, and Saul just needed his advice. It was possible. Interestingly, the witch could bring back the soul of Samuel, and Samuel appeared to them, and the witch was very afraid, and Samuel also was not a happy person, and just put a curse there. So God really warns us against this. So basically, it seems possible that deceased people, the souls of them, can somehow be brought back to us by some means, probably occult means. The Bible does not say that it's not possible, but it says we should not do it because it's against God's will. God's will is that dead people remain dead and the souls remain in this intermediary state, either with God or in the other intermediate state, something like Hades or something, prepared for the final judgment, but they should not be called back. And then there is this example of Lazarus, the parable of Lazarus, the poor Lazarus that is not that dies, and then he is in Abraham's bosom and doing well, and the rich man also dies, who has never taken care of Lazarus, and he talks to God actually and says, why can't Lazarus go back and tell my relatives that they should behave differently because I'm suffering so hard here? And they say, if they have Moses, and if they don't believe Moses, then they also won't believe if Lazarus comes back or anyone else from the dead. So it's against God's will, and even for that purpose, dead people should not come back. And then, of course, there are some really spooky and esoteric, mysterious things that can happen, like post-death appearances, as it is called. And actually, the Jews believe that when a person dies, it takes about 3 days that the soul finally leaves the body. I'm not sure. It's not in the Bible, but there seems to be some possibility that this might be true, because there are people who report that when a close relative of them or a friend died, that they actually had an encounter with them just shortly after they died, within a few days. And then there is a very spooky thing. I have a friend who is a theology professor, but also a practicing counselor in hospitals with seriously ill people. And he has talked to many patients who also had problems with being in coma and so on. And so he has had several people who talked about near-death experiences. And one, for example, was about a person, I think he was 3 weeks in coma in hospital. And when he recovered from coma and was conscious again, he remembered that during the time of coma, he became conscious and he met an old school friend. And this school friend approached him and asked him for forgiveness that decades ago he had taken away his girlfriend, his fiancée, I don't remember exactly whether it was the friend or the fiancée, and married her himself. And he wanted to ask for forgiveness and stretched out his hand to him. And he thought about it and then stretched out the hand and said, yes, I forgive you. It was decades ago and I'm now married myself, so yes, let's forgive each other. Then this person thanked him, turned around and left and was gone. And when he was conscious again, he heard by other people that exactly this friend had died in these 3 weeks. And this is the spooky thing, that maybe this was not just a dream or something, but it was really his soul realizing, I need to clarify some things and I need to meet that soul. And maybe Jesus allows that to some degree for some limited time. And so forgiveness was possible. I am not sure. I've just heard the story, and I would not really conclude or infer from that a theological dogma or a teaching, of course, because this is not in the Bible. I just say it might be possible, and there is evidence that consciousness, even in the comatose state, goes on. Gary Habermas has written a book, Beyond Death, which is very interesting. And he analyzes a lot of these near-death experiences, like people in the hospital who are in coma and need to be revived, resuscitated. And when they are resuscitated, they report that actually they left their body, they saw the room from the ceiling. Sometimes they could see even numbers of medical devices that were fixed on top of the device, serial numbers and so on, and they could report the exact number. Or they even left the room, went above the hospital and saw the hospital from above and said, there is a red sports shoe, a tennis shoe, with the laces of the tennis shoe bent into the inside of the shoe. And then the doctor or someone else from the medical staff goes up to the roof of the hospital and finds this tennis shoe. So there are these stories. Of course, they could be fraud, and some of these stories have turned out to be fraud, and people told, sorry, yes, it was a fraud. But other stories did not turn out as fraud. At least we don't know. So it's of course no scientific evidence, but there are these stories of people who tell this. That's a very good point. Well, first of all, it's a parable that Jesus tells us. So we don't know what in this parable is truth and what is just an image. We cannot be completely sure about that. But what we see is definitely that there is a separation. Both of them cannot come close to each other. They cannot help each other. They cannot touch each other. But there might be some perception. And then what we also can be sure is this is not the final state. It's just an intermediate state of the two. And maybe in this intermediate state, there is some way of communication possible. I'm not sure whether we can really conclude that, but it might be possible. We also cannot exclude it because the final judgment has not yet happened. because the person still asks for forgiveness for his relatives, the rich person. Can they still change? So it's not yet after the final judgment, and only after that we will be in heaven, or in the new earth and new heaven actually, and or in hell. So it's still an intermediate state, and I don't know about that, and how all that works. This is also a good question. I mean, my father-in-law, he's a doctor, a medical doctor, or he was, he's now retired. And he had a big sign at the entrance of his practice office where it says in Latin, Medicus curat, Deus sanat, which means the doctor cares and treats, but only God heals and can heal. And I think that's exactly the point. The doctor can use all the experience that we have from research and from medical treatments and so on, and apply this to people. But still, there is only statistics. When you are diagnosed with cancer, the doctor will say you have a probability of that and that you will survive, or that you will die in the next 2 or 3 years. But the statistics is absolutely useless for your personal life, because some people will die within a few days, others will die within a few months, and others will recover and even be healed and live for 30 years. So the statistics for your personal experience and for your personal life is absolutely useless. It's only a medical statistical value. And so for the individual case, even the doctor cannot know this. And there have been miracles also during COVID now. A friend of mine works in an evangelical high school here in Marburg, and they have a colleague there, and he was seriously ill with COVID and was already artificially inhaled. So in the very last stage, and doctors said he will probably have no chance to survive. But people prayed for him very intensely in the whole school, that he will come back, and he came back, and now he works again. So the doctors were just amazed how this is possible. And of course, some people have tried to analyze the effect of prayer on people. But the point is, prayer is always connected to your will be done, the will of God be done. And we don't know what God's will is. So you cannot even do a scientific study and test God with that, and then set up a statistic and say people who are prayed for are healed more often and more frequently, and others not. Because when a child asks me, can I have more ice cream? Of course the child wants to have more ice cream, but I might say no anyway, because I say it's not good if you have more ice cream. And as an adult, I know this, the child does not know that. And God knows what's good for our life. Like think about Hezekiah, or Hizkiah, the king. He also was very ill, very sick. And he turned to God and asked him, can I live more years, please? Give me some more years, and give me a sign with the clock, with the sun clock, that it would turn back. And God heard his prayer and gave him, I think, 10 more years, something like that. And in this time, he did a lot of stupid things. He opened his treasury to the Assyrian messenger. And so they saw, wow, he's very rich, or the Babylonian messenger. And so they invaded Jerusalem afterwards. And then his son that he actually became got in these 10 years was a very evil king later. So it would have definitely been better if he had died at that time and not had this other son and showed the treasury to the Babylonians and so on. So God knew why it would be good to go home, but sometimes God even is so gracious to allow that. Yeah, it's strange.
Oh, it's amazing. Like, God has a big plan and sometimes allows people to do as they will, just to prove the point that God's will is better, basically, isn't it? Yeah.
It's unfathomable, I would say. As human beings, we never know. And we never know whether what God is doing is just because he has pity on us, like with his Kia, and then something comes out which would have been better if he had died before that, or yeah, we just don't know the plans of God. We can only pray, God, do your best and help my life to bring the most fruit, and when my time has come, then let it be a glorious testimony to you when I die. I think it's important to pray for our end, for the end of our life and so on, that it will be glorious and a testimony for Jesus, because